mode.
Hello, I am Munira Lalani. Welcome to everyone joining us today, and thank you for spending an hour of your busy day with Astera. We are excited to share with you some of the breakthrough new features in our latest software release, Centerprise 6.0. I'll quickly overview Centerprise Data Integrator for those of you less familiar with the software. It's the perfect choice for your integration needs. A unique and powerful combination of usability, scalability, and connectivity. Please check our website for more details about Centerprise and to find out more details about what's new in 6.0. Today's agenda covers the most important new features and functionalities now available in Centerprise 6.0. Now I'll turn the webinar over to Mike O'Quinn, our Centerprise expert. He will go over today's agenda, followed by a presentation of all the new features, and then a question and answer session. Mike?
Hello, my name is Mike O'Quinn. I'll be doing the presentation and demo of Centerprise version 6. I'm also the support manager, so if you've ever submitted a ticket to our supporting system, you've probably come across me in the past. So with that said, I'll go over today's agenda and what we'll be discussing in today's demonstration. So first of all, before I get started, just know that anytime you can type in a question in the question and answer little question box on the corner of your GoToWebinar UI, type them in as we are going through the demonstration, and a panelist will go through and then ask them to me, and I'll answer them. And I'll answer as many as I have time at the very end. First, we'll start off with the new features for complex hierarchical data integration. And then we'll move on to exploring lookup enhancements that have been done in 6.0. We'll go over new transformations and functions and also enhancements to existing features. We'll look at some runtime enhancements to the engine and workflow. A brand new feature called Lineage and impact analysis. And some enhancements to the Centerprise integration server, including database clustering. And again, make sure that you type in all your questions, and we'll be happy to answer them at the end of the webinar. Okay, with that said, let's get started and look at the very first section in our demonstration, and that is the area of complex data integration, or actually say complex hierarchical data integration. Astera focuses on what we believe will be the most in demand considering the explosion of data mapping of these particular types of data sets. With Centerprise 6, we put a lot more emphasis on the ability to process hierarchical data sets. XML, EDI, COBOL, JSON, etc. can now all be more easily processed and integrated with the features presented on this slide, namely scope transformations, the flower transformation, and tree join transformations. Let's take a look at each one of those in the product. So we'll begin with the example of a scope transformation, and we'll examine the problem that the scope transformation solves. So this is a typical setup in version 5. We have a source and we have a target. And let's say that this is our data set. It is a hierarchical one with members. So in the case we have 3 members, and for each 3 members we have 3 member addresses, or not 3, but a number of member addresses. So here you can see that the first member has 3, the second one I believe has 2, and the third one has just 1. So what we want to do is we want to sort the collection within the collection based on a particular field. In this case, we want to sort by end date. So we want the most recent address at the very top of the collection. So now in version 5, we have those capabilities. We have the sort transformation that we can use. The problem is that we cannot insert a sort in between 2 set transformations, meaning that we'll run into this error. And I'm sure that if you've done enough of these data flows, you've probably run into this error. Pass-through depends on sort and XML source 1. Basically, it cannot depend on 2 transformations at the same time. So what the scope transformation does is it kind of gets you around this problem. So let's take a look at the solution to that. And now we have our data set here on the left side. And now you'll see this little bluish green dark heavy line here mapped from the top node to the bolded top node here. This is a scope map. What this does is it says I'm going to attach myself to this collection. And I'm going to perform this action, whatever the transformation is, to whatever it's mapped. So basically, for each one of these, we are going to sort this collection. So we're actually going to have 3 different sorts rather than just one. So what happens is if we preview the data now, we can see each of the members getting a sorted collection, in this case sorted by the end date. So in this example, we were able to use the sort transformation, but just know that you can use any transformation with the scope map. So this allows you to, for example, filter data, use the distinct transformation. Aggregate is a very powerful transformation to use in this regard. Any of the transformations you can use in this regard, and you can apply transformations within a tree without needing to go and route and then union data back together as you would in version 5. We also have a brand new transformation that works in conjunction with the scope transformation called the flower transformation. So you can think of the flower as kind of a shortcut to, let's say, a filtering or a sorting or even a picking out of an individual node in a tree. So for example, using the same example, what I'm going to do is flatten the structure, and I'm only going to choose the most recent address. So to do that, I'm going to select whichever node is designated by the current address marker. So if I open the properties for this brand new transformation, you can see that I've applied a filter here, and I'm saying, okay, where that current is equal to yes, I want to select the very first item. So that'll go ahead and allow me to use that as a single reference node in my tree and then map to my flat structure here. So this works very well when dealing with things such as EDI files where you have a collection of items, but each position in the collection means something different. So by the way, the flower transformation, the way it's named that way, stands for let, where, order by, and return. It's kind of a mouthful, but you can just think of it as a tree query. The last piece is the tree join transformation, and let's take a look at that. So this is an example of a problem in version 5 where we want to do something like this. We have 2 distinct data sets, and they are joined together by ID and member ID, the member ID referencing the master table here. And we want to construct a tree in this regard. So here you can see our final XML destination where we have the member top node and then we have the member address subnode. So if we go ahead and just combine them in a manner such as this, we'll again end up with the error saying that it cannot depend on more than one transformation. What the tree join allows us to do is it allows us to join these 2 pieces of information and join them in the correct, basically it'll stick the member address in the correct node based on whatever the member ID is. And this works exactly as the existing join in version 5.1, except that now when you're selecting the IDs to match, you're presented with a little tree here to select. So here I'm selecting from the top node ID and the subnode member ID. When these things match, I know which node to insert the particular collection of member addresses, and you end up with a collection that looks like the tree that we're looking for. And that is the tree join. And just keep in mind that you can join, you can keep joining. So if I need to join, let's say, stick another item in here, I can go ahead and just keep tree joining and to create the appropriate tree that I'm trying to create. So that is the tree join. And those are the three new hierarchical transformations and features that we've added in 6.0. Moving on to lookups, we've done quite a bit in the area of lookups. The first thing we've done is to add 2 new caching types to our lookups, the dynamic cache and the persistent cache. These are very handy when dealing with 2 very specific types of scenarios that I'll cover. And the third is the SQL lookup enhancements. So the SQL statement lookup is completely redone, and it should be very powerful, very useful if you use this feature in version 5. So let's start out by looking at the dynamic lookup. So in this case, you can see our data set. We have a bunch of addresses here. and we want to load them into our member address table. So the problem is that we also have a dependent table, which is this one's dependent on member table actually, so we have a master details relationship, and we have to insert a record into the member table if it's not already present. So this data set contains a list of addresses, but it also contains names of individuals that need to be added to our member table if they're not already there. So in what we've added to version 6 is the concept of the dynamic lookup. So what will happen is we can load all the values at start of the data flow and select the cache to the dynamic cache option. What this will do is if it encounters an item that's not currently in the lookup, it will generate a brand new ID for use in the both tables. So we can go ahead and process as if it were in the lookup table. And then at the very end, when it's about to insert into the member address table, it'll go ahead and insert into the member table beforehand. So that way you retain referential integrity. And here you can see where we're filtering out records to go into the member table based on the cache action. That is, once we preview here, you can see that some of them have the cache action into as insert, meaning that these names are not currently in the member table. So taking a look at the properties for the dynamic lookup, you can see that the lookup has changed slightly. Some of the options have been moved around, including lookup cache type as its own new section now, where you had the two previous no caching and static, and now you have the dynamic and persistent options. Once you choose persistent, you're given the option to cache after first use, or also fill cache values at startup. The second option here, you'll see the second page of options, I should say. You can return multiple options. I'll get into multiple in a bit. And then you have the value and the assignment options. And that is the the dynamic lookup. The persistent lookup is used in a scenario such as this one. So let's say that you have a scenario where you have to load multiple fact tables, for example. Here I'm loading my order fact table, and in order to do so I have to look up a piece of information from my product dimension table. I also have to do the exact same thing when loading my sales fact table. I have to look up that same product dimension table. So this is just fine, but you can imagine that there might be a problem if this lookup is used over and over again and it is a quite large lookup and I'm using the cache all values at start. So if this has millions of records, you can see that each flow is going to trigger a download of each, basically every single record to store into my lookup. So here's an example where I have a workflow which is chaining these things together. So ideally what we want is to be able to do this just once and all the other data flows in the workflow to use the same lookup, and that's exactly what the persisted lookup does. So here if we check the options for the persisted lookup, we can see that we have the persistent option, and once we choose it, we apply a label to it. So using this label, whatever lookup is using this label, it will use that exact same lookup. The best part is that when you use the persisted lookup, it's not stored all in memory. It's stored in an internal database on the server. So you can go ahead and have as large a data set as you want, and it's not going to affect the performance of the server. Okay, so that is the persisted lookup. Moving on to the dynamic lookup, the SQL lookup. Here's an example, a typical example of a SQL lookup, where we are passing in information to the lookup to be able to retrieve values based on some SQL statement we've written. So let's take a look at that SQL statement. So this is the same screen that you've had in version 5.x, but you'll notice that we're not using the parameterized statement here, meaning that there's no at and then some value that we're going to substitute when you run this data flow. And the reason why we've done this is now you can run this entire statement and cache the results of it. That allows us to then perform operations against that, whatever we retrieved from the lookup. So parameterized values are still allowed. It's all backwards compatible, but this gives you the option to not have to use them and to take advantage of the new features in the SQL statement lookup. So here you'll notice that we have the layout and a couple of additional columns here, including items in the layout to be used as inputs. Basically, these are the things we're going to map into. And then the items which are outputs are things that are going to be basically available to us in the tree of the lookup. And then we have the last column here for return, which is just used in the detached lookups, which I'll get into a little bit. So the next screen is where the magic happens. This is the new UI for basically selecting how you're going to perform the lookup. In this case, we have the equivalency operator set, and this is what you were implicitly doing when using the old version in version 5. And you only had the option to use equivalency. In this version, you have the option to not only use equivalency, but greater than equal, less than equal, and not equal to. This gives you the option to use date ranges, for example. You can have multiple items in this grid, say, date greater than this and less than that. So you can use and return not just one value, but multiple values from the lookup. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so that is the SQL statement lookup. Moving on to the next section are the new transformations that we've added in Centerprise 6. And those include the apply to all, which allows you to apply one function to a bunch of different fields. And this has been requested quite a bit. We finally implemented it. The expression list transformation, which allows you to combine multiple expressions into a single list. This has also been requested quite a bit. We've added it in 6. Text processors, which allow you to do a lot of the common processing that you would do with fixed length files, delimited files, and XML files, for example, and basically allows you to feed in that free-form text into that processing. And finally, the REST web service, which allows us to connect to RESTful web services, and basically a lot of customer-facing web services, such as the ones from Google, Yahoo, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. Whoops, passed up a little bit, but let's go ahead and look at some of those items from the new transformations, and starting with the apply to all transformation. So let's take a look at the old way that you would do this, and this should look familiar to a lot of you because I've seen this in a lot of your data flows, where you have a source feeding into a target, and in between you have a lot of expressions that are doing the exact same thing. So let's take a look at what this expression is doing. So if we take a look at the expression, we can see that it's saying if is null the value, then set it to 1, otherwise set it to whatever the value is coming in. So basically setting a default value to 1. So, and this is happening for every single expression for every single field. So basically it's kind of like a blanket processing that we want for every single field. In this case I only have 5 expressions. I've seen cases upwards of 50 all doing the exact same thing before it gets to the subsequent transformation or target. So what you probably have done, if you're familiar with the project structure in version 5, is you've probably done something like this. You've probably taken the source and then used a shared action so that at least you're only editing the expression in just one spot. And then you have it going into your target. So while this is a better option, you still have 5 different boxes here, which is cluttering up the diagram. The new way in version 6 is to use the apply to all transformation. So the apply to all transformation takes whatever you've mapped into it and will apply exactly one function to all of them. So in this case, I'm going to apply that logic, and I'm going to apply it using this special field name here called field value. So whatever we apply to field value, whatever we do to field value will apply to everything mapped into this transformation. So this allows you to perform these types of blanket processing using just one box, and therefore the diagram is much easier to read and much easier to maintain. The second transformation that we've added is the expression list transformation. You'll find that in the toolbox, and it'll look exactly the same. It'll be expression. So this is a brand new transformation, but it is backwards compatible, so it'll just replace your existing expression transformation. So you won't even notice a difference. It'll just look different when you actually open it up. So opening it up, you can see that, that now we have a grid of expressions rather than just the layout and that expression box. So in this case, we can see that we have several different calculations going on, and this one's using the overtime. The second one is using the hours dev and hours QA fields. And so they're all using different ones, so we cannot use the apply to all transformation. And we can't use shared action because these are all unique. So what we can do in version 6, though, is to use a single box, and then basically wherever we need a expression, we just add it. We just add a new field and whatever that expression is. So here you can see in this, for this value, I'm using this expression to compute the value. For this field, I'm using this expression, and for this field, I'm using that expression. All different expressions, and you can use previous values from other expressions to feed into new ones. So it's very powerful in what you can do with the expression list box. And again, it simplifies your diagram, makes it easier to read and maintain. Okay, so moving on to text processors. Here's an example of a data set where we might have data that is containing other data. So here we have 3 different records, but at the end of the record we have a special field that has an entire data set in it. Well, it's not a data set, but it's data that's formatted in a special way, meaning that it's comma delimited in this case. So what we want to do is take that data and parse it and be able to use it as if it were like any of our other pieces of data. So what we can use is the delimited parser transformation. So if I go ahead and preview the data here, you can see that I've gone ahead and parsed it based because I predefined this layout here. And using that predefined layout, it shows up in another node here called output. And here you can see that I have form 1, form 2, form 3, and everything parsed based on that comma delimiter, which I've specified in the parse transformation. So this is the delimited parser. You can also note that we have many different parsers. We have the delimited parser, the fixed length parser, and the XML parser. And also note that I'm only retrieving one record. So here you see this icon here, which is a reference node, which means that there is a one-to-one relationship here. So I can pretty much use these fields as if they were in my original source here. I can also change that to use multiple records by changing the option here from single record to multiple record. Doing so allows me to do things such as this. So let's go ahead and take a look at this data set. And you can see that I have, you can see that I have that exact same format, except now I have multiple of these separated by a slash. So if I go ahead and preview the data set now, you can see that I have, whoops, not that one, this one. You can see that I have multiple records underneath my single record here. So in effect, I've created a tree structure, and I can use this, I can use the aforementioned tree transformation capabilities in Centerprise 6 to be able to process them a lot better in 6 than I could in 5. And also note that we have not only the ability to build, to parse these things, we can also build this type of data by using the reverse parser, or the builder. And here you'll see that for every item that we have the delimited parser, we also have the delimited builder, same for fixed length and XML. So it works exactly the same way. So let's take a look at our data here. You can see that we've gone ahead and parsed it. And as soon as we parsed it, we're going to go ahead and take that parsed data and then just recombine it using the builder. And this is what the data set will look like. So we've gone ahead and pieced it back together into our original format that we had here. And again, this works for fixed length, delimited, and very importantly, XML. So you can build XML little packets to be able to send to a database, web service, whatever you need to do. Okay, so those are the text processors. Moving on to the next section is the web service. So let's take a look at that. So the REST web service is a complement to our existing web service capabilities, namely SOAP processing. So now you can hit RESTful web services, such as very popular ones like Google, LinkedIn, or even your own custom web service that uses a RESTful interface. The REST web service is slightly unique in Centerprise in that it can be used as a source, a target, or a transformation, depending on what you're basically setting for the HTTP method. So in this case, we're using a GET. We are hitting up Zendesk in this case, but again, you can use any RESTful web service. And you'll see that on the next screen, we're going to supply the layout. And we can process information either in XML or in JSON. So in this case, we're going to build a layout by running the request, and once we do, we retrieve the structure of the web service, and notice that it is a hierarchical structure. So which means that all of our tree joins and scopes and flowers, all of that applies and works very well when processing RESTful web services. So doing so, you can see that we have the structure here, and we're going to, in this case, we're just going to pull the title of a couple of topics from this particular resource and preview it, and I believe it'll be like 5 records or something, which will show here. There we go. And we're just taking the title here. So any type of processing with RESTful, you can do, again, you can do post, which would allow you to create things, update things, delete things, whatever the RESTful API provides for. Okay, moving on to the next section is the enhancements. So the enhancements are the things that we have existing in version 5, but have been improved somewhat in some way. So for example, let's take a look at the in-database joins, which will allow us to perform a join and do that so on the actual database server rather than on the Centerprise server. We have new data types which allow us to use time spans as well as decimals. We can use, in some cases, we can use sources as transformations, and this will allow us to feed in values into our sources so that they can output a data set restricted by whatever the input is. And then finally we have detached transformations, which will allow us to use transformations inside of an expression. So let's go ahead and take a look at these examples here. So I have the database join in a folder here. So let's see the typical example here. So typical example, I'm joining 2 flat structures into my flat join here. And I am going to join them. And what the problem here, though, is that these 2 tables are quite large. And let's say that I only have 5% match rate between the 2. That means most of the data that I'm sending back to Centerprise from my database server is being dropped off, it's being kind of wasted. And it would be much better if I could perform that join on the database server, which you could in version 5. You could just write your own query and perform the join. But then now you have a lot of development in these complicated queries. So with Centerprise 6, what we've allowed is the ability to perform joins in the database. So you'll find this on the page where we select what type of join it is, and you'll find this new option called Join in Database. Selecting this option will do exactly that. It'll perform the join in the database, and the good thing is you can keep joining, you can keep dragging and dropping more and more joins, and more selecting more and more joins in the database. So as the more options, the more joins you drag onto the diagram, that will basically create a larger and larger single query for the result set to travel across the wire. So this will do one thing, it'll do a couple things. It'll save on processing in Centerprise, and it will save, more importantly, on the data traveling across the wire. So this should improve performance tremendously. For this simple example where I have, I think about 10,000 and 100,000 records, this tripled the performance just using that database join. Once you start getting into the millions of records, the performance gain should skyrocket. And just note that this not only works with the flat joins, it also works with the tree joins as well. So you can tree join information in the database as well. Okay, so that is the tree join. The new data types that we've added are the decimal and the time span. So let's take a look at some of that. So let's go ahead and preview our data set here to show an example of how they are used. So here you can see, if I highlight my mouse over, you can see that the first number new is a decimal data type. Number old is the real data type, and that was the only decimal type that you were able to use in Centerprise version 5. And then we have our time span and our date time. So looking at the results of our of this processing now, just by setting the types, you can see that number new, which is decimal data type, has a much higher degree of precision compared to the version 5 real. Now the real is still available in version 6, but you now have the ability to use decimals as well. And also we have the time span. So for example, let's take a look at this expression or I'm just taking the start date, subtracting it from the end date, and that's going to give me this brand new data type, which is the time span. So I'm free to use this data type in a lot of different logic expressions to be able to control paths. You know, if the time span is this long, I can do that. So it's just an extra tool in my arsenal available for me in expressions. So it'll simplify a lot of things if you're using a lot of date comparisons, for example. So those are the data types. And then we also have the source as transformation, and that's here somewhere. Here we go. So let's take a look at this example. Actually, the example is not even a data flow. It is a workflow. So let's take a look at this example where you have a folder. In this case, it's this folder, and I have a bunch of different files in it. So in this case, I have a bunch of vendor files, and they're exactly the same structure, same layout, same everything. The only thing that's different is the name of the file and the contents therein. But you can think of it as one giant data set just separated by the file, basically the existence of the different files. So what we want to do for this example is we want to loop through the folder and process every single file. So this is how you would do it in version 5. I would go ahead and go through each file, and for every file I'm going to send it to a sub data flow, and every data flow is going to process this particular file individually. So this is great. The only problem is that each one of these files is going to create a job. So if you have a small number of files, as I have here, not a problem. You're just going to end up with this many jobs in your server log. The problem is if you're dealing with thousands, hundreds of thousands of files, the overhead of the jobs themselves becomes a performance detriment. So what you can do now in version 6 is do something like this. So in this case, I have the exact same file system. I can looping through the folder, but now you can see that I'm sending that file path to the input of the delimited source. So in this case, I'm using the source here as a transformation. So depending on the different source, you'll get a different input available for you to use. In this case, delimited files use sources, tables use, you can use fields, and you can use that to pass basically extract information for that particular variable putting in. And it'll always be multiple values coming out as opposed to like a lookup, for example, where you're just using a single item in and a single item out. So in this case, what we're doing is we're feeding a value in, and reading that file, and passing it on to the processing. So all of that happens. All of these files are processed within a single data flow in a single job. Now, you still may want the multiple jobs, but if not, if you don't care about that, you're just looking for performance, this is the way to go. So that is the source as a transformation. Let's take a look at the detached transformations. So let's take a look at this example where we have data which looks like this. So we have a list of names, but you'll notice that there's two different types of names. We have the names which are names of departments, and then we have the names which are names of people. And we can tell the difference because the names of people have a last name, comma, first name format. So we're going to take advantage of that knowledge to go ahead and use an expression to determine what we should do. So here you can see I have the lookup expression here, and you can see that is department has already been assigned by a previous expression. So we're going to take use of that, and we're going to say, okay, if it's a department, meaning that if it does not have a comma in it, I'm going to go ahead and execute this function. Now you'll notice that this function has a funny $sign here. What this means is the syntax means to perform a detached function, and that detached function is actually pointing to our lookup here. So it's actually going to run this lookup for this value on the department lookup. The member lookup is going to execute the member lookup. I should say this member detached function is going to execute the member lookup. So here we're able to use two different types of lookups without having to go through and use the 6 extra boxes and unions and routes and a lot of other transformations in order to achieve this. So the way we've done this is we've set this as detached, and once we've set it to detached, you'll notice inside we have the detached lookup properties where we're assigning the return column. Detached lookups can only return a single value, and that's because we need to be able to use that value in the expression. And then you have your input columns, and these input columns will be the items that you feed into that detached function. Okay, and then this will return me the appropriate lookup. There we go. And so in this way, with one kind of very simple data flow chain here, I was able to perform two different types of lookups using the detached transformations. Okay, so those are the detached transformations. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next section, which are the runtime enhancements. The runtime enhancements consist of variables, both action and data flow variables. These allow us to move basically information either within a single action or within a data flow and even outside of a data flow, between data flows. And then we have the job restart, which allows us to start where we left off in a job. And this is very useful if you get an error, for example, and you don't want to go all the way back to the beginning. You can use the job restart. And then we have the OR action, which is just basically the missing piece in our workflow flowchart in version 5. So let's take a look at those. Okay, starting with the variables. Excuse me. Let's take a look at the problem that we had in version 5. So this would be a typical expression that you might have in your data flow. If we open it up and see what the expression looks like, we can see that it looks like this. It says if state equals that, if to integer is greater than that, if state equals pi. So it's a very complicated expression, very kind of hard to read, hard to maintain if you have to go back 3 months later and look at it. Right? So what we want to do in version 6 now is to be able to basically chop that expression up and assign in-action variables to it. So you'll notice that this third column here is a variable. So what I've done to that expression now is I've taken the different parts of that expression and chopped it up. So now I have I'm storing those discrete parts into their own variable. So in this case, I'm just saying, okay, is California a zip, which is divided by this 950 barrier. If it is, assign it to Cal A. If it's not, assign it to is Cal B variable. And now I have all of this logic stored in these booleans. And I can use these booleans in another expression such as this. So here I'm using the result of a previous expression in another expression. And that's how we're able to use the in-action variables. You can also use these variables for doing things such as deduplication. So for example, the order that these things are processed is input, variable, and then output, and you can take advantage of that order to do things such as assign something to one value, and then on the next run, it'll compare that, and I can use this comparison to increment a duplicate count. So in this case, I'm using that capability to filter items that are duplicate. So this has been a common question asked to us, and that's why I present it here. How do I identify items that are duplicate? I don't want to use a distinct and have the first one go through and then the next 10 get caught. I want to catch all 11 of those duplicates. So you can make use of the power of the expression variables to do something like that. So here is an example of a data set where if there's any kind of duplicate, it'll find it. And then we have the flow variables, which are variables that carry between different flows, either data flows or workflows. So you'll notice here in the toolbox that we have the variables, which has replaced parameters. So any place where you had a parameter in version 5, if you load that flow into version 6, it'll show as a variable. So here's our variable. Let's take a look at it, and you'll see the number of mics. It's an integer type, and the output is, the type is an output. And this is important because we want this to be visible to the outside of the data flow. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking my addresses, and anytime I see a mic, I'm going to increment that count of this variable. And I'm going to use that in a subsequent workflow. So let's go ahead and take a look at the workflow here. And I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop my data flow. And you'll notice here that I have in the output, I have number of mics, which is my variable defined in the data flow. So I can use that to do things like, for example, do some sort of logic based on that. So I'm going to say if there is number of mics is greater than 3, which is way too many, I'm going to go ahead and send an email saying get rid of one. and we can use this processing in our workflow, in our data flows, wherever we need it. So this is very powerful if you need to maintain a value going across a workflow. And this is something that could not be done in 5. If you needed to do something like this, what I've probably suggested to you was that you write this into some sort of temporary table or temporary file for you to use later. Now you don't have to do that. You can just store it within the process itself in a variable. Okay, so that's the variable. Let's take a look. Before I continue, just want to remind you that there's a question and answer box in the GoToWebinar user interface. You'll find it at the very bottom here. So just feel free to type in your questions, and at the very end, in about 20 minutes or so, I'll go ahead and answer them. So let's go ahead and look at the job restart, and let's take a look at this example. All right, so this is a typical example you had in 5, where you have a really long running data flow, followed by another really long running data flow, and then followed by some short flow that, wouldn't you know it, breaks. So the problem is that, let's take a look at the server here, and let's take a look at our development, our jobs, is that it might look like something like this, right? So you have your workflow, which is here, which is our long workflow, and it goes ahead and it runs that first long-running data flow just fine. The second one, it runs it fine, and then it gets to that short flow and it completely breaks. So the recourse you had in 5 was, okay, I guess I have to restart it. So I would go back to my job scheduler and then go ahead and run it. So but now in version 6, what I can go ahead and do is I can go to the job that failed, right-click and select Resume Job. Now I can resume or rerun the job, but if I check the option to resume the job, what will happen, it'll start from wherever it left off. So it knows that it processed these 2 jobs correctly and that it needs to process just this job in order to complete the actual workflow. And that's what it'll do. So this is a very handy feature if you have some processing that failed halfway and you need it to go ahead and continue. Now this also works extremely well when you're in the process, when you're using failover servers. So if you have a database, a cluster of our Centerprise servers, you can have a job go down and another job will pick it up and resume where it left off. So that is the job restart. Let's take a look at the OR action. So the OR action is where you might have something like this, where I need to have execute this action based on either this one happening or that one happening. So the way this diagram is drawn right now, this is an implicit AND, meaning that this third action or this third task will only get run if and only if both of these complete successfully. Or I should say both of these routes complete. So if you can imagine if you have multiple decisions and whatnot, the logic can get quite complicated. So the AND, though, prevents you from doing where I just want to execute just one path or the other. So with the OR transformation, this solves the problem in that it'll do exactly that. It'll perform a logical OR, not an XOR, an OR, where only one of these needs to occur for this to execute. So let's say this one fires first, it'll hit this, it'll execute, and then run the third task. So this OR action has actually been there in version 5, but it was added at the very end of version 5, so we present it here because a lot of you may not know it exists in version 5, but it's definitely here in version 6. So that is the OR action. Let's take a look at another section, which is the lineage and impact analysis. The lineage and impact analysis is a brand new diagram in version 6, so it allows you to track the usage of certain items in a Centerprise project. So if you're using a particular field in a database or a file and it goes through certain transformations, you can go ahead and track that. Items to the right are the impact that if you change that item, it'll impact these particular items, and the items to the left are the lineage. So let's take a look at that. So looking at here, we have lineage example, and let's take a look at our project here. And let's take a look at one of the items that we have here. So here we have our, in this data flow, we have a table going through a bunch of different transformations and ending up in two different targets here. So we can go ahead and look at, let's say, the name here and say show lineage. Doing so will bring up this diagram. And you can see that it'll show me the node highlighted in blue here, slightly larger than the others, and it'll show me the impact of whatever I change in this diagram. Now I can go ahead and change and see lineages for elements. I can see them for actions, and I can also see them for documents. So if I'm using a shared action, I can see exactly which documents I'm using and which ones it'll affect. I can go back and change the lineage that I'm typically showing. In this case, now I want to see the lineage just for this action, and I can go ahead and trace back the lineage that we're using. But a very powerful usage of it would be to go back to the database table itself, and any table that I'm using, I can go ahead and highlight a particular column and select the show lineage. And this will show me the lineage across, if I have a certain option enabled, it'll show me the lineage across data flows within the project. So this is very handy if I need to, if I need to make a change to the database table, but I'm afraid what will happen if I make that change to all my data flows. Well, now you can actually see in a diagram what that change will entail. So that is the lineage and impact analysis. Moving on to the server now. So these are the enhancements to the Centerprise integration server, and it's arguably the biggest change that we've made from version 5 to version 6. So part of those changes are the unified server management, which allows you to basically manage all your servers from a particular location. You could do that in version 5, but now this is improved because now there's two different levels of management now. You have your actual individual server level of management, and then you have your logical server, which is the Centerprise cluster. The scalability is incredibly improved by the fact that now you can add multiple servers to your cluster instance. So in version 5, what you could do is you could add multiple servers to your Centerprise installation, but you had to basically route the jobs individually. You had to say, okay, job A went to server A, job B went to server B, and job C went to server C. So you kind of had to know which one would be loaded by how much, and if there was one job, one server that was overloaded and one that was not, that was the end of it. So also we have the ability, we've introduced high availability. So now in addition to these clusters being able to load balance, they also provide failover capability. So if a server goes down, another server will jump in and take its spot. Job management has been improved, and the scheduler blackout is a new feature that we've added, which allows you to, let's say, bring down Centerprise entirely from the hours of 12 to 3, for example, and that allow you to do maintenance. So you don't have to do this for each server. You just do that in one spot, and all the servers connected to that cluster will obey that blackout time. So let's take a look at some of the server features here. So first of all, you'll see here that we have a couple of servers that are unconfigured. Let's go ahead and configure those. Here you'll see that we have the database provider, and this database refers to the cluster database. So you're going to want to point them to the same database if you want, depending on which cluster you have. So here you can see that we have two different databases, which represents that we're using two different clusters. So we have our QA cluster and our development cluster, and I can just keep adding individual servers. The nice part is that the server configuration itself is very minimal. All you got to do basically is this: just point to the server, select the profile, the port number, and you're done. And these act as kind of like processors on a motherboard. So we can go ahead and look at some of these items. So here you see that we have a default profile. Let's take a look at what a profile is exactly. And the profile is just something that allows us to use the server in a particular way. We can use the server as a job manager, as just a file drop listener. So for example, let's say we just want to have one server that all it does is just listen for files dropped on a particular directory. As soon as it does that, it just fires it off as a job for another server to pick it up. So you can configure your collection of servers in any way. So by default, they do everything. And so adding a new server will basically be mirroring each server. So this allows you that will allow you that high failover, that high scalability that we were talking about. You can monitor the events in servers. So here you can see that we have a bunch of errors and information, warnings going on in the server. You can monitor the health of each server. So for example, here you can see that we have a couple of servers up and running, a couple of servers that are not licensed. So they are kind of in an ambiguous state here, but we can see the health of our entire network of Centerprise servers all in one spot. And then finally we have the cluster settings, which is typically the which you're used to in the Centerprise 5 server settings. And then of course we have the jobs and schedules. The job monitor has been improved a little bit, so you can see that the errors are highlighted in red. Other jobs are in blue or green. And then you can select different date ranges, such as yesterday, today, and the searching has been improved and being able to sort by status as well. So these are the improvements at the server functionality. Let's go ahead and take a look now at our summary. So in summary, Centerprise Data Integrator 6 provides key new features and functionality for accurately and efficiently processing complex hierarchical data. I can't stress how important that is with the new features of hierarchical processing, not just for hierarchical data, but also in instances where you have flat data and you need to provide temporarily a subnode. It happens quite a bit, and the hierarchical processing features are very powerful in that. The data flow enhancements and the new transformations are there. The enhancements to existing features allow you to get better performance and more efficient data flows. And that's, I think, the key piece here, is that not only is the performance greater in the engine itself, but we've given you the tools to be able to take your existing data flows and logically just make them a whole lot faster. The server management upgrades deliver scalability, failover, and streamlined job management. It's a much better and much more robust server than you might be familiar with in version 5. And hopefully you'll agree that Centerprise 6 is a lot easier to use and a lot more feature-rich. There's a lot of little features that we did not cover with the UI. You might have picked up on some of them, but if not, there's a tons of new goodies there that we'll be going over in subsequent webinars. So now I'd like to open it up for the question and answer session. So let's go ahead and look here. So I have a couple of questions already ready to go, so thank you for that. So when it comes to data processing, when it comes to data processing, at what point does data volume affect Centerprise performance? 100,000, 1 million, 10 million records. So in general, Centerprise performance is linear. However, sorting large data sets causes Centerprise to slow down. I would minimize sorting data whenever you can. So a lot of our transformations, you'll notice that have a little checkbox that say sort data. So if you can kind of do a little bit of forethought and do the processing with that data already sorted, either by ordering by in the database or maybe moving a transformation right after up at the particular place that's sorted in the data flow, that will cut down, because again, the sorts are not linear, but everything else is pretty much linear. And with the addition of the ability to add new servers, now you can actually scale these just by buying a new machine and throwing another server on it, and basically attaching another processor to it. So that is how Centerprise performance can be improved basically exponentially. So I don't have the exact numbers on Centerprise performance, but we do have benchmarking statistics that we have available on our website, and I'll be happy to point you to them at the conclusion of this this webinar. So number 2, are there any changes that we need to make, or you recommend that we make, to our version 5 workflows and or data flows with regard to parameter passing or shared expressions or shared connections? You don't have to make any changes. All your version 5 data flows will work perfectly in version 6. But if you're asking for advice on what we should do, I would, for example, make changes to parameters. If I'm, let's say, using a temporary database table just to carry a value, I would make use of the new variable feature. If you're using joins, I would make use of the database joins, because I know about 90% of the time I've seen a join in a support ticket, most of those have been joins within a database, two tables in a database. I would definitely make use of a database join in that regard. And as far as lookups go, I would definitely make use of the new caching options, particularly the persistent cache. That will be huge for a lot of you if that data set is not changed very often. Okay, question number 3. I saw your blog about name and address parsing. Can you briefly touch on that? Okay, so for the, let's go ahead and show that in the product. For the name and address parsing, we have, if I go ahead and create a new data flow, under the function transformations, we have this name and address section. Let's see if I have this installed. No, I do not have it installed. What I do have is the built-in name parser, and this will allow you to take a name in a very common format and just parse it. It'll split it up into first name, last name, suffix, and so on. We also have a name and address parsing pack, which is an additional add-on, which has a little bit more robust name parsing and also gives you U.S. address parsing, including being able to verify zip codes along with cities and everything. So it compares it against a huge database. Okay, question number 4. For processing of data flows, is there a finer granularity in the job log to see? Okay, sorry, where in the data flow is it spending its time? Yes, okay, so let's take a look at one of those. And let's look at this one here. Not that one. This one, for example. So let's go ahead and run this one. Oops. So here's the familiar job progress that you've probably seen in version 5. And note now that you'll see that we have these 3 additional columns in the job progress. One is the overall time per action. We get the records per second, and then we get the initialization time. So we can kind of discount if a particular transformation has a high initialization time, we can take that into consideration. But here we can kind of identify where the slowpoke is in the particular data flow. So this is very handy when you're in development and you need to identify, this data flow is running a lot slower than I thought. Where could it possibly be? Oh, I thought it was this join, but it turns out it's this subsequent lookup right after the join. So that would be very useful feature to use in version 6. Okay, where would I use the source as a transformation? You would use a source as a transformation. I think I gave a pretty good example in the source as transformation section there. You could use this, for example, in, like I said, where you need to go through a directory and loop through. You might also need to do something where, let's say you have an order data set and you need the order details and you need that for that particular order. You can send in that value from the source into your subsequent detail source and pass in the output into the input of that other source. So I know that sounds kind of complicated, but basically we were going to basically create a hierarchy and basically perform like a lookup. So for example, let's take the example of a lookup. We're using a single record lookup, change it to multiple record lookups, and that kind of gives you the approximation of how you would use the source as a transformation. Can I compare values in a current record and the previous record? So doing that, I think I gave you an example, perfect example in the, where was it? That was in the variables example. So let's take a look at that expression variables here. So that's exactly what I'm doing in this example. If I open up the properties here, you can see that I'm setting the current last name variable to last name. And the next time, for the very next record, I'm going to compare whatever I'm getting for the last name here. I'm going to compare it to whatever was stored from the previous record. So it's the order of these is important. So doing in that way, I can do a whole lot of nifty things with the expression. Okay, question 7. Do you have a full list of new features, even the small ones? Yes, we do. We have it on our website, and again, we'll We'll probably post a follow-up email with some of these answers that I don't have. I think there was 2 of them. And so we'll send you an email with links to that information where you can find it. So thank you. I think I'm out of time now. So again, thank you everyone for participating. We appreciate your participation. And we'll be offering monthly webinars focused on technical details of the key new features in Centerprise. So basically each section that we've covered will kind of go in deeper, a lot deeper into each one of those sections. We'll also be writing about them in our weekly blogs. Keep an eye out for emails that you'll get for details of this information. And stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Google+, etc. You can contact us at any time at astera.com. Call us at the number presented here. You can send us an email at sales@astera.com. Or if you'd like to speak with Manira directly, you can contact her at this phone number or send her an email at manira.lani@astera.com. Again, thank you very much. Appreciate your time spent with us, and have a good day, good rest of your day. Thank you.